Let me tell you something you need to hear today. God is not nervous about your situation. Heaven is not pacing back and forth trying to figure out how to fix what's happening in your life. While you're losing sleep, God is still seated on the throne. And when God says relax, he's not dismissing your pain. He's declaring his control. We often panic because we see the delay as denial, but God sees delay as development. You're asking, Lord, why hasn't it happened yet? And God is saying, because if it came too early, it would crush you instead of bless you. What you're waiting on is not just a destination, it's an assignment. And God will never deliver you to a place you're not ready to manage. You see, faith is not proven when everything is moving fast. Faith is proven when nothing seems to be moving at all. When the door stays closed, when the phone doesn't ring, when the answer doesn't come. That's where trust either matures or collapses. And God will often slow things down to show you what you really believe about him. Here's the problem. We want God to hurry, but we don't want him to deepen us. We want the promise without the process. But God is more concerned about who you become than what you receive. Because if he gives you the blessing without shaping your character, the blessing can become your burden. When God says relax, he's inviting you into rest. Not inactivity, but reliance. Rest says, I've done what I can do, and now I trust God to do what only he can do. Worry is the signal that you've stepped into God's lane. Peace is the evidence that you stepped back into yours. Remember this, before God shows it to you, he often hides it from you. While you think nothing is happening, heaven is coordinating details you can't see. Conversations are taking place you're not invited into. Doors are being aligned with keys you don't even know exist yet. Silence does not mean absence. Quiet does not mean inactivity. God has a pattern. He prepares the person before he presents the promise. He trained Moses in the wilderness before leading a nation. He developed Joseph in prison before placing him in the palace. And if God has you in a waiting season, it's not because he forgot you, it's because he's forming you. So stop rushing what God is refining. Stop forcing what God is framing. If God said it, he will do it. If he promised it, he will perform it. Your job is not to panic. It's to position yourself in faith, obedience, and trust. Relax. Not because the situation is easy, but because God is faithful. Relax. Not because you see the outcome, but because you know the one who controls it. What God has for you is coming, and when it arrives, you'll look back and realize the wait wasn't punishment. It was preparation. God's timing is intentional, not accidental. That means nothing in your life is drifting randomly through the universe, hoping to land in the right place. There is a divine schedule governing your steps, your delays, your detours, and even your disappointments. What feels slow to you is strategic to God. He does not operate on urgency. He operates on sovereignty. When God delays, it's never because he's confused. It's because he's committed to a greater outcome than the one you're currently imagining. We struggle with timing because we interpret life through our calendars while God operates through his purposes. You're watching the clock. God is shaping the character. You're counting days. God is counting depth. And often what frustrates us is that God refuses to adjust his timetable to our emotions. But if God moved according to how we felt, we would be blessed before we were built, promoted before we were prepared, and elevated before we were equipped to handle the pressure that comes with it. Intentional timing means God knows not just what you want, but when you need it. And more importantly, when you're ready for it. Readiness is not about desire, it's about capacity. You may want the breakthrough, but can you steward it? You may want the platform, but can you survive the scrutiny? You may want the increase, but do you have the discipline to manage it without losing your soul? God's timing protects you from receiving something too big for the version of you that currently exists. What we often call a delay is actually God working upstream. He's adjusting circumstances, aligning people, rearranging systems, and sometimes removing obstacles you don't even know are in your way yet. If God answered some prayers immediately, you'd walk straight into resistance you weren't prepared to overcome. So he waits, not to tease you, but to shield you. His silence is not indifference, it's orchestration. Intentional timing also reveals where your trust really lies. When things don't happen on schedule, anxiety exposes whether your faith is rooted in God or in outcomes. If peace disappears the moment progress slows, then faith has been replaced by control. God allows timing tension to teach you the difference between trusting Him and trying to manage Him. You can't rush God and still call it faith. Faith rests in who God is, not in how fast He moves. But God's timing is layered. There's personal timing, relational timing, and purpose timing. You may be ready in one area, but not another. You may be spiritually eager, but emotionally immature. You may be gifted, but not grounded. God sees the whole picture at once, not just the piece you're focused on. That's why He doesn't consult you about the schedule. Sovereignty doesn't need permission. Another reason God's timing is intentional is because He wants the glory, not the confusion. When God moves at the right time, there's no doubt it was Him. If it happened when you expected it, you'd attribute it to strategy, networking, or luck. But when it happens after the door was shut, the resources dried up, and your strength ran out, then only God gets credit. Divine timing eliminates human boasting.br. Intentional timing also creates testimony. The wait ad. DS wait to the miracle. The longer the delay, the clearer the evidence that God intervened. What you endure before the breakthrough becomes part of the story that encourages someone else. If it came quickly, it would bless you. But if it comes at the right time, it will bless generations beyond you. God's timing is never late, but it is often last minute from our perspective. That's because God likes to step in when human solutions have reached their limit. He waits until you've exhausted what you can do so that you can clearly see what only He can do. Not because He enjoys watching you struggle, but because dependence grows best when self-reliance fails. So when nothing seems to be happening, remember this: God is not behind schedule. He is ahead of your understanding. Every pause has purpose. Every delay has direction. Every wait has wisdom embedded in it. The same God who set the sun and moon on time has your life on time too, even when you don't understand the clock He's using. Waiting is not wasted time. It is preparation time. The problem is we live in a culture that measures value by movement, speed, and visibility. If nothing seems to be happening, we assume nothing is happening. But God does some of His deepest work in the seasons where progress looks invisible. Waiting is not God putting your life on hold. It is God putting your life in training. What feels like stagnation on the outside is often transformation on the inside. We confuse waiting with inactivity, but biblical waiting is active trust. It is not sitting back in frustration. It is standing firm in faith. While you're waiting, God is strengthening muscles you'll need later. He's sharpening discernment, deepening humility, and developing endurance. These are qualities you cannot rush, outsource, or microwave. They only come through time under pressure. Waiting exposes what you lean on when forward motion stops, when the applause is gone, when the opportunity hasn't opened, when the promise seems delayed. Waiting forces you to confront where your identity really comes from. Are you defined by productivity or by purpose? By achievement or by assignment? God often uses waiting to strip away false sources of confidence so that your trust can be rooted fully in Him. Preparation requires patience because God prepares you for what you pray for. You may be asking for greater influence, but influence without wisdom can destroy you. You may be asking for increase, but increase without stewardship leads to loss. So God lets you wait while He trains you how to handle what's coming. Waiting seasons teach you restraint, obedience, and sensitivity to God's voice. Things you will desperately need once the door opens. In the waiting, God also works on alignment. He aligns your motives with his will. Sometimes you want the right thing for the wrong reason. Waiting purifies intention. It shifts your prayer from God, give it to me, to God, prepare me for it. That change in posture is critical. B, because God blesses surrendered hearts more than ambitious ones. Waiting develops spiritual maturity. When answers are immediate, faith remains shallow. But when answers are delayed, faith must grow roots. Roots are built underground, unseen, but they determine how tall and stable the tree becomes. God often hides the process because if you saw everything he was doing, you'd try to interfere. Waiting teaches you to trust God even when you can't track him. God also uses waiting to build endurance. What he is bringing will last, and anything that lasts must be supported by strength. Waiting teaches you how to remain faithful without feedback, obedient without reward, and hopeful without evidence. That kind of endurance is essential because the blessing you're praying for may come with pressure, resistance, and responsibility. God would rather delay the gift than deliver it to someone who would collapse under its weight. In preparation seasons, God refines character. Skill may open the door, but character determines how long you stay in the room. Waiting deals with pride, impatience, entitlement, and shortcuts. It teaches you how to say no when yes would be easier, and how to keep integrity when no one is watching. These lessons don't feel productive, but they are foundational. Waiting also positions you for divine encounters. Many people miss God's voice because they are too busy rushing to the next thing. Waiting slows you down enough to hear him clearly. It sharpens your spirit, tool awareness, and deepens your dependence. In the quiet, God reveals things about himself and about you. That activity would have drowned out what looks like a pause is often God building capacity. He's expanding your emotional resilience, strengthening your spiritual backbone, and increasing your ability to carry responsibility without breaking. When the moment finally arrives, you'll realize that if it had come sooner, you wouldn't have survived it. Waiting is not punishment. It is proof that God sees potential worth preparing. He doesn't rush what matters. He invests time in what he plans to use. Every day of waiting is depositing something into you that will be required later. When the promise shows up, you'll discover that the wait wasn't empty. It was essential. Anxiety often comes from trying to control what belongs to God. The moment you assume responsibility for outcomes that only God can govern, peace becomes a stranger. Anxiety is not merely an emotional response. It is a spiritual signal that you stepped outside your assignment. God never asked you to manage the future. He asked you to trust him with it. When you try to take over God's role, your soul begins to carry weight it was never designed to hold. Control feels safe because it gives the illusion of certainty. We plan, predict, calculate, and rehearse worst-case scenarios, thinking that preparation will protect us. But what we call preparation often turns into preoccupation. Instead of planning wisely, we start worrying endlessly. Instead of acting responsibly, we start obsessing compulsively. Anxiety grows when responsibility exceeds authority. You can influence some things, but you cannot control everything, and pretending you can is exhausting. God's sovereignty means he governs what you cannot see, touch, or manipulate. When you attempt to control outcomes, you are essentially declaring that God's management is insufficient. That may not be your intention, but it's the implication. Anxiety says, if I don't handle this, it won't work out. Faith says, even if I can't handle this, God already has. The difference between the two is not intelligence or effort, it's trust. Anxiety also reveals misplaced ownership. Some burdens feel heavy because they don't belong to you in the first place. God never asked you to fix people, force doors open, or guarantee results. He asked you to be faithful, obedient, and available. When you confuse faithfulness with control, you end up stressed over things you were never meant to carry. Returns when you give responsibility back to the rightful owner. Trying to control outcomes also leads to impatience with process. When you believe everything depends on you, waiting feels dangerous. Silence feels threatening. Delay feels like failure. So you rush decisions, settle for substitutes, and push doors God hasn't opened yet. Anxiety-driven choices often create the very problems you are trying to avoid. When God is removed from the driver's seat, fear takes the wheel. Anxiety thrives when your focus shifts from God's character to your circumstances. The more you magnify the problem, the smaller God appears. But when you recenter on who God is, faithful, all-knowing, all-powerful, you begin to realize how unnecessary your panic is. God does not need your worry to do his work. He needs your trust. Worry doesn't speed God up. It only wears you down. Control also feeds the illusion of self-sufficiency. Anxiety whispers that you must figure everything out alone. But faith invites you to depend on God daily, moment by moment. Dependence feels uncomfortable because it requires surrender, and surrender feels like weakness to a world obsessed with strength. Yet in God's economy, surrender is not weakness, it's wisdom. Letting go is not losing control, it's gaining peace. When anxiety dominates, it distorts perspective. You start reacting instead of discerning. You start fearing possibilities instead of trusting promises. God wants you anchored, not agitated. Anxiety pulls you into the future before God arrives there with you. Faith waits for God to move in his time and in his way. God's invitation is not to ignore responsibility, but to release control. Do what you're called to do, then step back and let God do what only he can do. There is a difference between obedience and overreach. Obedience brings peace because it stays within God's boundaries. Overreach breeds anxiety because it invades God's territory. The cure for anxiety is not more control. It's deeper trust. Trust realigns your role with God's rule. It reminds you that the same God who brought you this far is fully capable of taking you the rest of the way. When you release what was never yours to control, your heart finally finds rest and your soul remembers that God is still in charge. God works behind the scenes before he works in front of you. What you see is never the full story, and what you don't see is often the most important part. We live in a world that celebrates visibility, speed, and instant results, but God specializes in hidden work. Before he makes a public move, he always completes a private process. What looks like silence is often set up. What feels like absence is usually activity taking place out of your line of sight. Behind the scenes work requires trust because it offers no immediate evidence. You don't see the conversations God is orchestrating, the relationships he is aligning, or the resistance he is quietly removing. You don't hear the prayers being answered through people you haven't met yet. You don't witness the doors closing that would have led you into harm. Yet God is fully engaged, weaving details together with precision that only he can manage. We often want God to act visibly so we can relax, but God asks us to relax so he can act invisibly. Faith is required when there is no proof, no applause, and no confirmation. God's hidden work trains you to trust his character rather than his clues. If he showed you everything he was doing, you would rely on information instead of faith. So he keeps the process unseen to keep your trust anchored in him alone. God works behind the scenes to prepare the environment before he positions the person. He arranges timing, systems, and circumstances so that when you step into what he has for you, it fits instead of fights you. When God moves you publicly, it will not be chaotic. It will be coordinated. What looks sudden to others is often the result of a long and visible preparation. Hidden work also protects you from unnecessary pressure. If everything God was doing became visible too early, opposition would arise before you were ready to face it. God shields the process until it's mature enough to withstand resistance. Just like a seed must remain underground before it breaks through the soil, God keeps some things concealed until they are strong enough to stand in the open. Behind the scenes, God is also working on you. He's shaping your attitudes, adjusting your expectations, and refining your dependence on him. Public success without private depth leads to collapse. So God deepens you where no one is watching. He strengthens your prayer life, your discernment, and your humility in the quiet places so you don't lose yourself when visibility increases. God's unseen work often involves delays that feel confusing. But delay does not mean denial. It means development. He is synchronizing your readiness with the right moment. If the opportunity showed up before the alignment was complete, you would struggle instead of succeed. God refuses to rush what must be rooted. Another reason God works behind the scenes is to ensure that the outcome gives him glory. When things come together in ways you could not manipulate or explain, it becomes clear that God orchestrated it. If everything happened according to your planning, you might trust your strategy more than his sovereignty. But when the breakthrough arrives after all human options have failed, faith becomes the only reasonable explanation. Behind the scenes work also teaches patience. It trains you to remain faithful without feedback and obedient without recognition. God watches how you handle the quiet seasons because they reveal your true motives. Are you serving for visibility or for obedience? Are you trusting God for who he is or for what he gives? The hidden season answers those questions. What God is doing in secret will eventually surface in strength. Nothing God prepares privately is wasted publicly. When the moment comes, the transition will feel sudden, but it will not be shallow. You will step into something that has been carefully crafted, divinely timed, and strategically prepared. Even when you feel overlooked, God has not lost sight of you. Even when progress seems invisible, God is actively at work. The same God who sees in secret also reveals in due time. Trust the process you cannot see, because God never starts something he does not intend to finish. And what he's doing behind the scenes is essential for what's coming next. Faith grows strongest when circumstances look weakest. That truth runs contrary to human logic because we assume faith should increase when evidence improves. But faith is not fed by favorable conditions. It is forged in unfavorable ones. When everything around you is unstable, uncertain, or deteriorating, that is often the environment where faith either deepens or dies. God allows weak circumstances not to break you, but to build a trust in him that does not depend on what you see. When things are going well, it's easy to confuse faith with comfort. Success can mask where your confidence truly lies. Resources are available, doors are open, and momentum is on your side, so trust feels natural. But when those supports are removed, when the door closes, the answer delays, the strength runs low, faith must stand on its own. Weak circumstances strip away distractions and force you to decide whether you trust God's promises or just his provisions. God often permits conditions to deteriorate so that faith can mature. Immature faith needs constant reassurance. Mature faith rests in God's character even when reassurance is absent. When circumstances look weakest, you learn to lean on what God said rather than what you feel. Feelings fluctuate, situations shift, but God's word remains steady. Faith grows when you choose to anchor yourself in what is unchanging while everything else is in motion. Weak circumstances also expose counterfeit faith. There's a kind of belief that only works when life cooperates. But real faith operates in contradiction. It says, even though I don't see it, I still trust it. God allows pressure not to embarrass you, but to reveal what's authentic. Pressure doesn't create faith, it reveals it. What comes out in difficulty shows what was truly inside all along. In weakness, faith learns dependence. Self-sufficiency thrives in strong circumstances. But when your strength fails, your options shrink, and your resources run dry, faith discovers the sufficiency of God. You realize that what you lack in control, God makes up for in power. What you lack in clarity, God supplies in guidance. Weakness becomes the doorway to a deeper experience of God's presence. God is not threatened by weak circumstances. He does not require ideal conditions to do his best work. In fact, he often chooses unfavorable conditions so that his involvement is unmistakable. When faith survives in weakness, it brings glory to God because it testifies that trust was not based on convenience, but on conviction. Weak circumstances also refine your prayer life. When things are easy, prayer can become routine or optional. But when life feels fragile, prayer becomes vital. You stop performing and start pleading. You stop explaining and start depending. Faith grows when prayer shifts from a habit to a lifeline. In weakness, prayer becomes honest, raw, and deeply rooted in need and God me. To you there. Faith in weak circumstances also reshapes your expectations. You stop demanding quick fixes and start trusting long-term purposes. You realize that God may not remove the challenge immediately, but he will use it effectively. Faith grows when you learn that God's goal is not always comfort, but conformity, shaping you into someone who reflects his nature regardless of conditions. Weakness also develops perseverance. Faith that has never been tested cannot endure. When circumstances remain difficult longer than expected, faith learns how to wait without wavering. It learns how to hope without evidence. It learns how to obey without applause. That kind of perseverance becomes spiritual strength that carries you through future storms. In the weakest moments, faith becomes personal. It moves from theory to experience. You stop talking about what God can do and start testifying about what God has done for you in the dark. Weak circumstances become sacred ground because they are where you encounter God in ways comfort never could. When faith survives weakness, it emerges resilient, anchored, and unshakable. You may feel fragile, but your faith becomes formidable. What looked like the end becomes the foundation. What felt like loss becomes leverage. In God's hands, weak circumstances do not diminish faith. They develop it into something strong enough to stand no matter what comes next. God's promises are certain, even when progress seems silent. Silence has a way of unsettling us because we often equate noise with movement and activity with advancement. When nothing appears to be happening, doubt starts whispering that maybe God has forgotten, delayed too long, or changed his mind, but silence does not cancel certainty. God's promises are not sustained by visible progress. They are sustained by his unchanging nature. We tend to measure fulfillment by motion. If doors are opening, conversations are happening, or circumstances are shifting, we assume God is working. But when those indicators disappear, we panic. What we forget is that some of God's most significant work occurs in seasons where there is no outward evidence at all. The absence of visible progress does not mean the absence of divine activity. It simply means God is working in ways that cannot yet be measured or monitored. God's promises rest on his character, not your circumstances. Circumstances change, feelings fluctuate, but God remains faithful. If his promise depended on what you could see, it would rise and fall with your environment. Instead, his word stands firm, regardless of how quiet the season becomes. Silence tests whether your trust is anchored in God's voice or in constant confirmation. Progress often goes silent before it becomes substantial. Seeds grow in darkness. Foundations are laid underground. Systems are built behind closed doors. God often moves silently, so that when the promise manifests, it is rooted, stable, and lasting. Loud beginnings can produce shallow, low results, but silent seasons often produce depth and durability. Silence also protects you from premature conclusions. If God revealed every step, you might misinterpret the process and abandon faith too early. Silence forces you to rely on what God has already said rather than demanding new evidence every day. Faith matures when it learns to rest in past promises during present quiet. God's promises are not time sensitive in the way we are. We live bound by deadlines and expectations, but God operates from eternity. What feels delayed to you is still perfectly on schedule to Him. Silence does not indicate hesitation. It reflects precision. God knows exactly when fulfillment will produce the greatest impact and the least damage. Silent progress also exposes your motive for believing. Are you trusting God for who He is or for the reassurance He provides? Silence removes the emotional rewards of faith and leaves only conviction. When faith remains steady without reinforcement, it becomes strong, resilient, and deeply rooted. During silent seasons, God often strengthens your discernment. When external signals fade, you become more attentive to His presence. You learn to recognize God, not by dramatic signs, but by steady peace, consistent direction, and inner conviction. Silence teaches you how to walk by faith rather than by sight. God's promises also remain certain because they are not dependent on your performance. You may grow weary, you may question, you may struggle, but God's faithfulness is not fragile. His commitment to His word does not waver because of your weakness. Silence is not God stepping away. It is God standing firm while you learn to trust Him more deeply. Silent progress teaches patience. It trains you to wait without losing hope and to continue obeying without immediate reward. Obedience in silence is powerful because it declares trust without conditions. It says, even if I don't see it yet, I still believe it's coming. When the promise finally manifests, the silence will make sense. You'll realize God was never inactive. He was intentional. Every quiet moment was a building block. Every unseen step was essential. What felt empty was actually full of purpose. Silence refines faith, deepens trust, and solidifies hope. God's promises do not weaken in quiet seasons. They grow stronger beneath the surface. And when the time is right, what was silent will speak loudly, proving that God's word was certain all along. Rest is an act of trust, not laziness. In a world that glorifies hustle, exhaustion is often mistaken for faithfulness, and constant motion is seen as commitment. But God does not measure devotion by how drained you are. Rest is not quitting. It is acknowledging limits and honoring God's authority beyond them. When you rest, you declare that the outcome does not depend solely on your effort, but on God's provision. Many people resist rest because they fear losing control. Slowing down feels risky when you believe everything hinges on your activity. But rest confronts that belief head on. It forces you to admit that you are not the center of the operation. God is. Rest says, I've done what I can, and I trust God to do what I cannot. That posture requires more faith than frantic striving ever will. God designed rest as a rhythm, not a reward. You don't rest only after everything is finished. You rest because God is still working even when you stop. When you refuse to rest, you act as if God's work pauses when yours does. But God's power is not fueled by your exhaustion. He does not need you worn out to move things forward. In fact, exhaustion often clouds judgment, weakens discernment, and makes you vulnerable to fear. Rest recenters your trust. It pulls you out of performance mode and back into dependence. When you are constantly active, you can start believing that success is the result of your effort alone. Rest interrupts that illusion. It reminds you that God is the source, not your strength. Choosing to rest is choosing to believe that God is faithful enough to sustain the work without your constant supervision. Rest also guards your heart. Busyness can numb your spiritual sensitivity. When you're always rushing, you miss God's quiet guidance. Rest slows you down enough to listen, reflect, and recalibrate. It allows space for God to speak and for you to hear without distraction. Far from being unproductive, rest sharpens focus and renews clarity. God often calls people to rest in the middle of unfinished business. That feels counterintuitive because rest seems logical only after completion. But resting before everything is resolved demonstrates trust in God's timing and sovereignty. It says, I may not see the full picture yet, but I trust God enough to pause. That kind of trust honors God deeply. Rest is also a form of obedience. When God invites rest, ignoring it becomes a statement of self-reliance. God knows your limits better than you do. He understands that constant strain leads to burnout, bitterness, and brokenness. Rest protects you from becoming so tired that you lose perspective or compromise integrity. It keeps your soul healthy so your purpose remains sustainable. Rest does not mean neglecting responsibility. It means releasing anxiety. You still show up, you still serve, you still act, but you do so without carrying the weight of outcomes. Rest shifts your focus from results to relationship. It reminds you that you are valued for who you are, not just for what you produce. Rest also strengthens faith because it forces patience. When you stop pushing, you must wait. Waiting without working can feel uncomfortable, but it teaches you to trust God's pace. It reminds you that God is not rushed and that his timing is not threatened by your stillness. True rest produces renewal. It restores energy, restores vision, and restores hope. When you rest, you return stronger, clearer, and more aligned. God does not ask you to rest because he wants less from you. He asks you to rest because he wants more for you. Rest is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the quiet confidence that God is capable, attentive, and faithful. When you rest, you are not stepping away from responsibility. You are stepping into trust. What God is bringing will require the strength he's building now. Every season of pressure, delay, and stretching is not random. It is training. God never delivers a blessing without first developing the capacity to riot. If he gave you what you're asking for without preparing you, the very thing meant to elevate you could overwhelm you. So before the promise arrives, God focuses on fortifying the person. Strength is not built in comfort, it is forged in resistance. Muscles grow when they are challenged, not when they are idle. In the same way, spiritual, emotional, and mental strength develop through difficulty. God allows challenges not to discourage you, but to condition you. What feels heavy now is increasing your ability to handle heavier responsibility later. The weight you're carrying is shaping you for the weight that's coming. God sees the full scope of what he plans to release into your life. You see the blessing. He sees the pressure that comes with it. You see the opportunity. He sees the expectations, opposition, and accountability that will follow. So God builds endurance before exposure, resilience before recognition, and humility before honor. Without that strength, the blessing could damage your faith instead of deepening it. Strength-building seasons often feel unfair because they seem disconnected from the promise. You're wondering why the struggle looks nothing like the outcome you're praying for. But training rarely resembles the event it prepares you for. Repetition, discipline, and resistance feel monotonous, yet they are essential. God is developing habits, character, and spiritual stamina that will be necessary once the doors open. God also builds strength by allowing you to face limitations. When you reach the end of your ability, you discover God's sufficiency. Weakness teaches dependence, and dependence builds strength that self-reliance never could. When you learn to lean on God in hard seasons, you gain a resilience that does not collapse when conditions change. Another way God builds strength is by delaying gratification. Immediate fulfillment can weaken discipline, but waiting strengthens resolve. Delayed promises teach you patience, perseverance, and focus. These qualities will be critical when the blessing arrives, because success often brings new challenges that require steady faith and emotional stability. God strengthens your inner life before he enlarges your outer life. Public expansion without private fortification leads to burnout. So God works on your thought patterns, your emotional responses, and your spiritual priorities. He teaches you how to stay grounded, how to manage disappointment, and how to remain faithful without recognition. These lessons protect you when visibility increases. Strength building also involves pruning. God removes distractions, unhealthy attachments, and misplaced dependencies. Letting go can feel like loss, but it creates room for growth. God strips away what weakens you so that what remains can be strengthened. What you lose in these seasons often makes you lighter, freer, and more focused. God's preparation is thorough because his promises are significant. He is not shaping you for a moment, but for longevity. The strength he's building is not just for the breakthrough, it's for what comes after it. Sustaining a blessing requires more strength than receiving it. God is committed to your endurance, not just your arrival. When the promise finally comes, you'll realize the struggle was not wasted. The discipline will make sense. The delays will seem necessary. The pressure will feel purposeful. You'll step into the next season stronger than you were before, capable of handling what once felt impossible. God never prepares you for something he doesn't intend to give you. The strength being built in you now is evidence that something greater is ahead. What feels heavy today is shaping you for tomorrow. And when it arrives, you'll stand, not barely surviving, but fully strengthened, ready for everything God has planned. Thank you for allowing me to share this message with you. May it strengthen your faith and steady your heart. Goodbye for now. And remember, what God has promised is on the way, right on time.